I'm going to just welcome everyone for joining us for this workshop on public financing of elections and how to get big money out of politics. My name is Olivia Zink. I'm the Executive Director of Open Democracy. We're a small nonprofit in Concord, founded by Granny D, that works on getting big money out of politics, as well as redistricting reform and voting rights. And I'm going to turn it over to our other panelists for today.
Okay, so I'm Nick Nyhart, and with me is Adam Eichen. I'll just introduce myself briefly, and then Adam can introduce himself. I've worked in the money and politics space since the early 1990s, both at the state level, the regional level, including New Hampshire in the 90s, and then at the national level from the mid-90s on. And I've worked with activists all over the country at the state and local level who wanted to see the money in politics change, and many of them organizing together, much as people are in New Hampshire, have passed successful systems that have really changed things. So I'm excited to be here today. I think that this issue is more important than ever. The big money problem was bad 30 years ago. It's even worse today. And we have huge issues that confront us. I'm sure all of us worry about, right in the middle of this pandemic, when you have a bailout, do you trust the government to do what's right for all Americans, or are special interests going to get a disproportionate piece of that pie? When you think about issues like the climate change, how that gets resolved, is that going to be done with everyday citizens' voices, or will big money torque that towards those interests? So there's never been a more important time to take up this issue. And Adam?
And I think that, as Nick, you said, we're already seeing that with the stimulus packages that have been released today. So big money has quite the influence, whether in crisis or no crisis. So I'm Adam Eichen. I am the campaigns manager for an organization called Equal Citizens, founded by Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig. We're nonpartisan and pro-democracy, and we work on a national level to fight for citizen equality. So voting rights, gerrymandering reform, and especially campaign finance reform, with a real focus on public financing of elections. Before I joined Equal Citizens, I wrote a book with Francis Moore Lepay called Daring Democracy, dealing with all these issues, again, with a focus of public financing of elections. And like Nick, I see these issues as critical. They may, as we say at Equal Citizens, they may not be the most important issues, but they're the first issues to address, to make sure that all of our other concerns can be addressed, and that we can together create a world that we actually want, instead of one that we're perpetually disgusted by.
Right. So Olivia, you just want us to dive right in now?
Sure.
Oh, good. Here we go. So let me start, and then I'll turn things over to others. But right now, what Adam and I were just discussing, you have a system where there are extraordinary problems facing us, and I don't think most people trust that their own voice will be heard when our elected officials make those decisions, whether it's at the state level or the national level, or even in many cases the local level. We worry about, are they going to listen to me and my neighbors, or is there a lobbyist somewhere in the legislature or a developer in City Hall who is going to have their voice heard more than it should be? And are we going to get the right kinds of decisions made? And I think when you look at the flow of money in politics right now, you see at almost every level, big money playing a disproportionate role. And what we want to do through the kinds of solutions we're talking about, small donor-based, publicly financed systems, voter-owned elections is one word, called democracy vouchers in other places, clean elections in other places. But what it does is take the current system and turns it upside down. So what do I mean from that? So right now, a huge amount of campaign money comes from just a handful of people. In fact, a third of all federal money, federal political money in the last election came from donors who gave $1 million or more, right? So a third of the money, a huge chunk, comes from people giving $1 million or more. That's just about 400 people who gave $1.5 billion into the federal election system to basically get their way and be able to hold candidates accountable afterwards. So what we've said is, how can we design a system so it's just the opposite? It's small amounts of money from everybody that a politician is held accountable to. So rather than being held accountable by a few really big donors that you need to rely on to compete in your election, could we design a system so you needed to rely on ordinary people and therefore got to be held accountable by them for your election. So you had to spend your time currying favor with the ordinary citizens in your district, which is really what democracy is supposed to be about, all of us having an equal voice. And so that's what we can do with some of the systems we see around the country that are based on small donations that then leverage a significant amount of public funding in order for a candidate to be able to run a competitive race. One question is, why is this a good solution? Well, one, the current system needs to be changed, but why pick this solution? So there's an old saying, the person who pays the piper calls the tune. And these systems of small donor-based public financing allow ordinary constituents to call the tune with their lawmakers when these lawmakers are going to be voting on how much you pay in taxes, what kind of healthcare system we have, energy policy, financial protections for consumers, all those kinds of things. Let's have the people be in charge, and at least in terms of who the candidates have to rely on to get elected. So that's the big thing that these systems do. These laws also allow grassroots candidates who don't have access to networks of big donors, who don't come from a place of privilege, who aren't connected to the wealthy, be able to run for office in a level playing field and have a good chance of getting elected. So that's the other thing we've seen in these systems, that it opens the door to candidates of diverse backgrounds whose strength is in their ties to the people in their community rather than the special interests when they want to run a campaign. And I also should add in here, these systems are constitutional. We've had a Supreme Court, sort of a runaway Supreme Court, that has made it much easier for big money to play a role in politics. And this system of, rather than regulating the big money out, which the court has said, basically, we're not going to let you do, it says, let's allow people to exist on a different kind of system without depending on the big money. So these public financing systems, so far, the Supreme Court has affirmed them every time it's been asked to rule. So where do they have them? I think there's a map that Olivia has. There we go. There are cities and states all over the country, from Seattle to Washington, D.C., from Maine to Arizona, more than 24 just jurisdictions in all that have enacted these systems. Some are stronger than others. Some apply to certain offices. Some apply to all offices. But it's been happening in diverse communities all around the country, as you can see from this map. Just to make it simple, because we can get in the weeds here pretty easily, there are basically three kinds of these systems, but they all have one thing in common, that a candidate who demonstrates they have broad community support by raising a lot of money in small donations, or a lot of small donations from people in their district, the people that they want to represent. Once they've qualified that way, they go on to get public financing, enough money in the end that allows them to run a competitive campaign. So that's what they all have in common, that you raise a lot of money in small donations from people in your community, and then you pass a test and you get authorized to get the money. So for instance, in Maine, where the districts for the state legislature, the House of Representatives, are relatively small, probably somewhat like New Hampshire, not quite as small. They have 9,000 people in a state rep district. You have to collect $65 contributions to qualify for their clean elections program. Different places, though, have different ways of allocating the funds. In Maine, Connecticut, and Arizona, once you qualified, you get a lump sum, a grant to pay your campaign bills. And you can't take any more campaign money after that. So you get a grant, that's what you have to run your campaign. If you qualify during the primary, you get one grant then, and if you win your primary, you get a second grant, but the same rules apply. You don't take any other money. So that's sort of called the grant system. They were in vogue, so to speak, more in the 90s and early 2000s, before the Supreme Court attacked some of the provisions in those systems and made them less ethical. There was less efficacy. But those are in play in several states. So they're often called the grant systems or clean elections. The second system, they have probably the best known system is what they have in New York City, that's been around for decades. And there you qualify by getting small donations. But after that, every contribution you raise from someone, up to $175 if you're running for city council, gets matched 8 to 1. So that means if I have a house party, for my campaign, and you give me $25, that gets matched 8 to 1. So I get another $200. So someone who can give you $25 actually is worth $225 to you. And that goes up to $175. So it basically says there's a reason to pay attention to people who can give you 5 or 10 or 25 or 100 or $175. You can run a campaign based on that kind of money. So that's what we call a matching fund system. And there are systems around the country that are like that might match 6 to 1 or 4 to 1. And one county in Maryland said, we're going to match the first $50, 6 to 1, and the next 50, 4 to 1, and the next 50, 2 to 1. So we can encourage people to get even more small donors in and make more meaningful a $10 or $25 contribution. So those are called matching funds. And then there's a third system, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. It's a newer approach that's working now in Seattle. It's worked through 2 elections, and it's called a voucher system. So on your screen now, you see a $25 voucher. And every resident in Seattle, you don't have to be a voter, every resident gets 4 of these in the mail. If they lose them, they can replace them online. And so each of your 4 vouchers is worth $25, and you can assign them to any candidate who's qualified for the program. And again, they qualify by raising a fixed number of small donations. In Seattle, it's $10 donations. And if you're qualified, you agree to a lower contribution limit and a spending limit also. And then, you go out campaigning door to door or online and asking people for their vouchers. And other candidates are going to be asking for them too. So you compete at a really retail level with other people for these $100 of vouchers that every citizen can give you. Most people, as it turned out, have given all their vouchers to one candidate. But it's increased the kind of grassroots campaigning we've seen. It also increases the number of people who want to run for office because they think, I don't need to depend on a few well-heeled people. I can depend on people in my community. And this is the promise of the voucher system, that even as someone is homeless or on Social Security and may not be able to give you $5 or $10 or $20, still has $100 to give you. It also forces more participation. In a voucher system, if I get, or rather a matching fund system, if I'm in New York and I get $100 from you, I get another $800 from the city. If I'm in the voucher system, I get $100 to you, I got to go to the next door and get 7 more people to give me their vouchers. So it also encourages more participation. And that's the system they've had in place now over 2 elections, first in 2017, and then more recently in 2019. The system is capped. All the systems, in fact, are capped. They don't give you an unlimited amount of public financing. But in Seattle, if your opponent spends more than that, or they're outside independent expenditures, you're released from your spending cap and you can keep raising relatively small donations so you can get elected. And here's where I want to dig into Seattle a little bit more, because there's a good news story. A question comes up about, with all the independent expenditures and all the big monies that the Supreme Court lets in, can this $100 campaign system really work? Can it withstand this? And we got an answer for that I think is quite hopeful in Seattle in the 2019 elections. Last year, things came to a boiling point between the city council and Seattle's big business community. One of the biggest issues in Seattle is affordable housing. The booming tech sector there has brought new well-paying jobs into the city, but the city's housing supply has not increased as quickly. That's bidded up the cost of housing and exacerbated the problem of homelessness in the city. So there's a big housing problem there. And the city council said, okay, we have these wealthy corporations in the tech sector and other people doing quite well in Seattle, bringing new employees here. What if we have a per employee tax on those companies based on the number of people they employ here in Seattle, and then with that tax fund a solution to our housing problem and the homelessness problem? So they said, let's do this. The business community stepped in and mobilized against it. The city of Seattle council said, we're going to cut this in half. So compromise, cut in half. They said, no, we don't want to pay a cent. And they had the city council actually repeal the moderate compromise version of the bill. And then they went further. And in this election, they said, you know what? We want to elect a business-friendly city council here. And they poured money into this 2019 elections, the second time around for vouchers, where 7 of the 9 council people were up for election, they poured more money in an independent expenditures than Seattle had ever seen. It actually, if you added up the past 10 elections, the amount of the amount of independent expenditure money in the last 10 elections was less than what Amazon and the Chamber of Commerce were pouring into this election. So you think, okay, we've seen, the biggest of the big money. What happened? In fact, there was so much. I asked one little local political consultant, how much big money was there? And he said, there was so much big money that you could not buy any more ads online. They bought out everything you could do. So they spent as much as you could. And in the end, they supported a slate of 6 candidates, and 5 of them lost. It was big business candidates against candidates who were more attuned to the community. And 5 of those 6 people lost. So the answer was, you can spend as much money as you want. At least in this race with the voucher system, it didn't wash away the good of having so many small contributions in. And I think it's a lesson. It's sort of a, yes, we can stand up to big money. So I'll stop there and turn it over to others. But that's why we think voter-owned elections is a possible solution, and small donors can stand up to big money.
Great. And so in New Hampshire, we have seen big money in our state races. You saw independent expenditures outweigh expenditures that the gubernatorial candidates had made. We also, an HPR story said that a quarter of the funding in New Hampshire elections comes from lobbyists. So we know we have a problem nationally. We also have a problem at the state level as well. And that's why here in New Hampshire, we're advocating for our Senate Bill 304, which would establish a public funding system in New Hampshire. This system would be similar to the Seattle system. It would give every New Hampshire voter 4 $25 certificates to give to the candidate of their choice. They're called voter dollars here in New Hampshire. It is a voluntary system where candidates choose to opt in. Unfortunately, in the Senate this year, it was turned into a study so that it wouldn't automatically implement. The state legislature would study it for a year to make sure they got all the details right before implementing a system such as this kind of change. What's really important to know about this system is that there's bipartisan support for it. Independents, Republicans, Democrats, all would rather have our elections funded by voters of New Hampshire instead of out-of-state donors and big corporate money that flows into the election system. This system would cost about $3 per person per year here in New Hampshire. And when we think about our tax dollars, we know we want to spend our tax dollars wisely. But another statistic to just keep in mind is that I pay $11 in taxes a year to subsidize a insurance company. And so I much rather have $3 going towards making sure elections are funded by voters here in New Hampshire so that the interests of New Hampshire voters can be represented. And so this bill is currently in the Senate, the House of Representatives. Due to the coronavirus, our state house is on a break right now. It's tentatively back in session on April 10th, but this bill was scheduled to have a hearing the Tuesday before the State House closed. So we know that the advocacy will be needed right when they come back into session. I'm going to turn it over to Adam.
Thanks, Olivia. So, I mean, first and foremost, to anybody on this call now or anybody listening later, the work that Open Democracy Action is doing on this is critical. This is the organization to get democracy reformed through the legislature in New Hampshire. So I encourage everyone to really help where they need it, because Olivia, Brian, and the whole team is doing some really fantastic work, especially around public financing. So it's very, very exciting. Of course, the difficult part is actually getting this passed. And while a lot of progress has been made, public financing is incredibly, incredibly difficult to get a legislature to approve of. Nick has a lot of experience on this. A lot of the reforms or public financing reforms in the past have been passed via the ballot. Connecticut is an exception. It was passed, but only after a massive corruption scandal in 2005, and the governor had to resign. So oftentimes it's either via ballot or the legislature passes it after a major corruption scandal. But that doesn't mean it's the only way to get it done. Because one of the amazing parts about working on democracy reforms, whether it's public financing or common sense reforms like no excuse absentee balloting, which is critical right now during this crisis, and New Hampshire still doesn't have that, or automatic voter registration, or gerrymandering reform, which Open Democracy also succeeded in passing through the legislature, is that all of these things have really broad nonpartisan support. You can say it's bipartisan, but again, that excludes independents. That really Americans of all political beliefs truly believe in the concept of fairness in our democracy, in our political system. Whether it's gerrymandering reform passing in Utah, deep red Utah, or public financing in Berkeley, California. The list goes on and on with all of these process reforms. Americans are fed up with a system that they don't feel represents them. And you see this in poll after poll after poll. There was a great poll in 2015 that revealed 85% of Americans wanted at least fundamental change in the way we fund our elections. 85% is more than a supermajority. I don't really know how to quantify 85%. There aren't many issues where there's such large agreement on. Again, poll after poll shows that. And so our job as advocates is to tap into that kind of, deep belief in fairness and wanting the system to represent all Americans, not just those who can contribute or not just those who have the most power. And when we can harness that power, we can harness that agreement, amazing things can happen. And again, you see this again and again and again. There's a great book that's about to come out written by David Daley, who previously wrote a book on gerrymandering reform, and it chronicles all of the amazing reform efforts that have happened across the country when activists and groups like Open Democracy and even politicians come together and fight in a nonpartisan way for structural systemic reform to ensure that everyone has a voice. So all that being said is the odds are great to get big money out of politics and to pass something like public financing of elections. But it's incredibly doable when messaged right. And that's the key, is that you have to message it right. That if you really think about it, whether it's Donald Trump campaigning on draining the swamp or Bernie Sanders saying the system is rigged or anything in between, this really is a unifying issue. And so when we engage in this, when we talk about public financing, it has to be about making sure every voice is equal, because ultimately that is what is incredibly salient for voters. And so anything around in New Hampshire is going to be highly politicized because it's a swing state. And so sticking to the nonpartisan line is incredibly important. But even more important, while there's an innate sense of fairness or wanting of fairness in the political system, process issues are still very hard to message because they seem kind of removed from our daily life, especially in a time like our current crisis, where our number one priority has to be to ensure that this terrible virus stops spreading, that we have to promote people's health. But the key point about money in politics and all of these reform issues is that we can connect them so easily to the issues that we care about. So Nick mentioned earlier the environment or this bailout package. The more we can connect big money in politics to concrete issues that more directly affect our lives, the more salient public financing becomes, the more clear it becomes to somebody who really hasn't thought about these issues, why a system reform has to come first before we get action on climate change. You think about the financial collapse, or think about the healthcare reform bill in the early or late 2000s, so 2009, 2010, during the Affordable Care Act. Industry spending during that fight was through the roof. The healthcare industry was spending so much money to ensure that whatever passed, if something was going to pass, that they made sure that they approved every line. And maybe they wouldn't get everything they wanted, but they had lobbyists on every single line, every single word, so they knew exactly how to create a loophole. They knew exactly what to do to make sure that they could get the most of what they wanted. And so, we see this in political campaigns. Running on healthcare is something that directly appeals to people. And the more we can make this about healthcare, about environment, about jobs, about corporate giveaways, about a fair tax system. The tax thing is very salient for conservative voters. A lot of conservative voters really think the tax system is unjust. They don't like what they call crony capitalism. Well, a large part of what they perceive as crony capitalism, unnecessary giveaways, subsidizations of unnecessary things, largely that can be attributed to money in politics, to the number of lobbyists and campaign contributions. And so the more as we fight for this, we can make issue connections to things that people care about. That's how we get this done. Again, you see this in case after case after case of these reforms winning. And the other thing is, as Nick mentioned, when you're talking about public financing, it's a real touchy subject because it requires money. It's not a free reform. It requires funds to then distribute. It's public financing. And that often can rankle some people who are not big on government spending. But the real way to flip that on its head, and the way we have to conceive of this as activists, is that in a democracy, we get what we pay for. You have to conceive of that if we don't spend any money on democracy, if we're not providing public financing, we're getting a democracy that's not well taken care of. Same with roads, right? Any public good. If we're not spending money on roads, we're going to have potholes. But the more money we spend on it, the more we can fix the roads. We can ensure that the utility of democracy can continue to function as it should and to benefit everyone, not just those who can pay for it. And that's a critical reframe of how we talk about public financing, because ultimately, again, as Nick said, the current system, this current privately held government, the system of private donations determining who can run for office, who gets time with a legislator, who can hire the most people to go over the different lines of a bill. These are all things that shuts Americans out. And the more we can highlight that and say that public financing is something that can bring more people to run, that we no longer have a gatekeeper class of financiers who can determine who's a viable candidate or who gets the most time with a member of the state house. When we really frame it that way, it becomes, again, more salient, and people are much more apt to believe that this is something that's worthy of their time. Because the other thing that makes this very difficult in working for democracy is when you're asking someone to participate in an activist effort, in an advocacy effort, you're asking to give up precious time, their precious time that they could be fighting for many other things that they care about much more than an arcane subject of public financing. And that's why the more real you make these reforms, the more you can draw those issue connections, the more you can talk about equality of outcome and access in our democracy and our political system, the more apt you're able to actually convince someone that this is worth their time, especially in these difficult circumstances. But above all, when it comes to messaging, I think what's most effective in my experience, and I think in others, is talking about that this is part of a larger movement, that this is not just a bunch of, or a small group of good government activists trying to do something totally removed from the rest of the country. But the more you can frame this fight for public financing, and of course, no excuse absentee balloting, gerrymandering reform, all of the issues that open democracy focuses on, as part of a broader movement for democracy reform. Again, I mentioned gerrymandering reform in Utah. There was one reform in Colorado and in Missouri, in Ohio. Public financing, as Nick said, there was a reform that just passed, or it's been a long time, but they updated it in New York City. It passed in Denver, Colorado. Again and again and again, you see activists across the country fighting for these process reforms. And the more that we can frame our efforts in New Hampshire as part of a broader national democracy movement, it gives people more of a sense that what they're doing, they're not alone in this fight, that they have the wind at their backs. And I think that gives people more of a sense that what they're doing has value, and that they're not just shouting, into a void, that they're building in unison with others. And even if they can't see them, because the media doesn't often prioritize these stories, which is a real shame, because I think a lot of these stories are amazing success stories, and I wish everyone could just see what national advocates for democracy see every day, of the amazing Americans rising up to ensure not partisan advantage, but actually trying to unrig these rules to ensure that everybody has a role to play in our government. That's a very inspiring message. And so the more we can kind of hearken to those broader ideas of a democracy movement, I think it can move people from a sense of apathy or hopelessness around these issues. Because again, there's so much belief, if you talk to people when doing this work, that, oh, well, there's always money in politics. We can't beat the big corporations. We can't do that. The more you can say, well, look at the people in Seattle. They passed public financing, and look what happened there. They were able to beat back Amazon. And they were able to ensure a government that wasn't taken over by some of the largest corporations in the world. The more we can kind of create that narrative of citizens rising up and fighting back and actually having success across the country, whether it's a red state, red city, blue city, no color, whatever we're talking about, the more we can kind of make it less partisan and part of a broader narrative about this long arc of democratization in our country, the more successful our advocacy efforts will be. And the last thing I'll say really quickly is language is incredibly important when talking about public financing and money in politics. There's a large debate among reformers about language and about what is the most apt to motivate people. A lot of folks like to use the word corruption. Corruption is a very activating word when it comes to this stuff. It really gets people angry. But corruption can also lead people to be a little bit depressed, that it in some respects demotivates them to believe that there's a solution. And so we have to be very careful about how we use words. And Nick is a pioneer in this. One phrase that works really, really well when messaging something like public financing is focusing on the every voice aspect. And I say that because Nick used to run an organization that they named Every Voice. But they did it in a very smart way, and he can talk more about this, because again, that idea of every voice mattering in our government, in our democracy, in our politics, that should ring true, and that should be an aspiration of every American, because that's so core to our kind of, maybe somewhat of a mythology of democracy in America, because we've never fully had a democracy in America. It's been incomplete, imperfect since the very founding. You just have to read the original Constitution to know that. But this idea, this belief that every voice should count in our democracy is potent. And the more we can elevate that positive messaging when fighting for public financing, or however we want to phrase public financing, that's a whole nother discussion that we can dig more into, the more successful we're going to be. So watching our language, appealing to making this explicitly nonpartisan, being very clear to connect public financing as not just some dull process issue, but the key to unlocking our future to address things like climate change and a livable wage and a fair tax system. All of these things, are key to ensuring that public financing not only just becomes a salient idea, but actually can pass. And it's only going to pass, I should say, in a place like New Hampshire with a broad citizen movement, that politicians don't often change the system that got them elected unless they're pressured. And that's why the work that Open Democracy is doing is so critical, because we're only going to win these fights if enough residents of New Hampshire demand it. It's not something that happens through passive engagement. It's a demand. It's a demand for a more equal democracy, one in which every voice is heard.
Great.
So let me pick up here and talk a little bit about keys to winning and forming a campaign. I think what Adam laid out is excellent. And I'll just say that I think corruption fires people up, but it's also a little depressing, right? And you also need to leaven that with the idea of every voice being heard. So you need to promote an alternative, and the alternative matches up well with the policy when you see small contributions that anybody can make, leveling the playing field. I guess what I'd also add is that in all the years of doing lots of focus groups and lots of polling, what was so clear is that people wanted their voice heard, and they didn't feel the current system allowed it to be heard. So saying every voice gave the idea of fairness, but also your voice gets included when we talk about every voice. So that was, and while the words we use to describe that and the examples might change from state to state or from decade to decade, the core, I think, idea that everybody wants their voice heard in politics, and their voice to count and them to be recognized and their needs be recognized, goes with this idea of every voice being heard. So always coming back to that, as well as saying we need to stop the corruption, I think are two issues that, or two ways of talking about this that work hand in hand. I'd say three things on, organizing on this long term to win. One is aim high. The second is build a big coalition and include in that coalition people who, or groups, organizations that count electorally. And the third thing is persistence, persistence, persistence. So on aim high, start out with a good model. Don't say, well, we're going to get compromised, so let's start with what we think will get us to 50% of the votes in our legislature plus one, because that isn't going to inspire people to build the base that you need to build or attract the groups to the coalition. You want to hold up the best, most fierce example of what you want to win, and that's plausible to win, and that will work, but aim high. Because that's going to make it easier to inspire people at the grassroots level and build the broad coalition you need to win. You want to hold up something that's inspiring. And I would say, when you get into the legislative compromise part, I've always advised groups that I've worked with to compromise down on the number of offices that it impacts, rather than compromise the system. So it is, again, if you can at least say we're going to build on something really excellent for the statewide races or for people on the governor's council or whatever, but if you have to compromise, don't compromise around the core of the system. Instead, say, well, we'll take it for few offices and have the confidence that once we build it for some offices, we'll get it for others. That actually was the strategy they did in North Carolina, and it worked for years. They started with appellate court races, right? State appellate level judicial races that are elected, because the legislature thought, well, if we're going to try somewhere, yeah, because that's way off, that's not as important, we'll test it there. But it worked really well, and so they expanded it to Supreme Court races because they had an elected Supreme Court in North Carolina. And then they expanded it to what are state department heads. So there you had the superintendent of public instruction and the insurance commissioner elected. And they said, well, money plays a role in these races. So they added those races in, and they were gradually expanding it because the system itself was so strong that they could make the case that it made a difference based on the previous, what they'd done. So that strategy worked there until a far right group basically took over the state government and gutted those reforms. First thing they did was to get in and gut those reforms. But so I'd say aim high. Second, build a really broad coalition. And the coalitions that have won have included labor organizations, but also some prominent big business people in the states that have won it. They've included environmental groups, civil rights groups, community groups, consumer groups. So across the board, build a broad coalition. I also think that it means starting early on the coalition building, because you want, before you take off with a bill, it's great to have a coalition that includes at least some groups from all those different sectors. You don't need every labor union, but get some of the key ones, some powerful ones in. You don't need every business leader, but get a few people who are well-known statewide to endorse an idea early. So that's the ideal. Not every group in the world, but get some representatives from all those different sectors in to build a broad coalition. I said build a coalition that includes groups that do electoral politics. Because at some point, if you're dealing with a legislature, making an example of somebody who's against these reforms and then loses their election because of that is a very, very powerful component. That can work the other way too. So nationally, there's a group called End Citizens United, and they went into the congressional races in 2018 and said, you know what? It's actually great to run on money in politics. Running on cleaning up the system is really good. And those people said, well, I'm in a swing district, because that's where they put most of their effort. They could go either way. And they said, well, here's polling that shows in your district, you're going to actually win more votes on public financing and other democracy reforms than you'll lose. So they were able to make that point, had people run on those issues, and saw that they really went well with voters, especially swing voters who might vote for Republicans some of the time. And that was really key to getting people in swing districts to have an electoral group weigh in and be part of the coalition. And then I'd say finally persistence. And I want to close on this point. And it takes me back both to Seattle and Connecticut, which have been mentioned before. In Seattle, they won around 2-1 on the ballot in 2015. But before that, they'd actually put it on the ballot with not everything all together, not able to raise the money they needed to win. They lost in 2013. So they won in 2015, but a key step was actually putting it on the ballot. Not enough people got involved in the coalition, but they came really close, demonstrating the public was ready for this. And it said to everybody, if we can build a bigger coalition and we can raise enough money to have grassroots organizing, we could win this thing. And so they went ahead and went from about 49% of the vote in 2013 to close to two-thirds of the vote in 2015. So they were persistent. They didn't take that loss as saying this won't work. They instead took it as a building block and went on. And in Connecticut, there was a clean elections bill in the legislature, I think starting in about 1994. And in 2000, they actually won the bill in the Senate and the House in the state, and they lost it because the governor vetoed it. And there were a couple things about that. One is a lot of people said, you wouldn't have gotten this vote if the governor hadn't been ready to veto it, because some people said, I'll vote for it because I'm not going to have to live by it because I think the governor will veto it. So then maybe they got some free votes, but they showed they could get a majority vote. And a few years later, in 2004, there was a huge set of corruption scandals. They led to a number of public officials being indicted or leaving office, including the governor of the state of Connecticut. So he left office in late 2004, and in 2005, they launched a big campaign to win public financing. They had the coalition in place. They were able to raise money to hire lots of grassroots organizers. They had a Republican governor who took over from the previous Republican governor, and she was like, I was his lieutenant governor, but I don't buy into that corruption, and I will be a leader for reform. And so all that pressure came together, and all of a sudden lawmakers realized, if we pass something, it will become law, because they had a Republican governor who said, I'm ready to sign something. And so they brought people together, and yet there was stubbornness. They couldn't get the House and the Senate to agree. They couldn't quite get to the number of votes. And despite having a huge campaign, when the legislature closed in early June, they lost. And every newspaper pundit, every political expert said this thing is dead. They gave it their best shot. And the reformers said, it's not over till we say it's over. And they demanded a special session. And they got one. So they were called on other issues, but they said, you got to consider our issue. And it failed again and again. I think there were 4 or 5 special sessions. Finally, in December, they were able to keep bringing pressure and said, we're not going to quit. And I think the lawmakers had seen direct actions on their fundraisers. They'd seen constant pressure. They were getting phone calls at home from angry citizens saying, why haven't you come out for this bill yet? And so they passed it at the end of the day. But it was because of that persistence. It was first the long run up to being able to pass a bill, continuing to keep it in the House and in front of the House and the Senate. And then when the opportunity arose, they went for broke and never gave up, and they won it. So you could say it was it took 16 years or 12 years of failure to win. But that and that in fact is true. But I think it's really, that's what it takes to win. You have to go and go and go again, and have confidence that grassroots pressure and eventually corruption scandals will lead the way to victory. So that's the third piece of advice, which is persist, persist, persist. Because I think just about in every case, people thought they'd lost or they actually did lose before they won. So that's a key element. So that's what I have to say on how to win.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I think for our New Hampshire fight, we have definitely been persistent. This bill has been introduced over again and again, and it will continue to be introduced until reformers win these solutions. And we need your help building a bigger coalition. I know the League of Women Voters New Hampshire president is on the call with us today, and the League has been right with us for the fight for public funding for the last 20 years, and we need other community groups, and we need to continue to build the advocacy movement in New Hampshire for these reforms. But right now, we really need people to call your New Hampshire election law committee or write them a letter, write letters to the editor to expose how money in politics impacts our community. And we need people to continue to educate in their own community. Many of the folks on the call are part of what are called regional team leaders, and doing different programming in your community, showing films around the problems and the solutions, to demonstrate to others that we can really win these big, bold democracy reforms like public financing, because we do fundamentally need to change this system. And I want to reflect on a story that I once when I was talking to someone about this reform. They weren't quite sure that this was the reform. They had so many questions about how it's going to work and who it's going to impact. And then I said, well, we could keep the system as it is and allow corporations and unions to, make the political contributions and get what they want. And that was the pivotal moment that really shed the light on this in this person's mind, that we need to fight for a different system where we can have public financing going to running our elections, because it's a fundamental reform. Otherwise, the private industry will still fund our elections. So there are additional handouts and materials on our website, and we will follow up with everyone on the call to share more. Yeah.
I just want to add one thing. I've forgotten to mention this, and you'd asked me to talk a little bit about it. What's happening at the federal level? So there is an excellent bill that's been passed in the House and the U.S. House of Representatives. It's called H.R. 1. It's an omnibus democracy bill that helps us on everything from gerrymandering to voting rights to money in politics. And it includes a matching fund system, a 6-to-1 matching fund system for Congress, as well as reviving the presidential system of public financing. And that bill has unanimous Democratic support in the House, unanimous Democratic support in the Senate. And the basic plan is, if the Democrats win control of the Senate next year, to move that bill. So there will be a chance to win public financing for Congress if the elections sweep out just a handful of Republicans and replace them with Democrats next year. And they've all gone on record as being in support of this issue. So in theory, if we get a majority, there's a real chance of winning. And my guess is Republicans will also begin to come to play when they see this is real. They will say, we'll offer to make it bipartisan if we can tweak this or that. So I think there's actually the potential of a bipartisan bill if the Democrats can really put it on the table. But right now, it's Mitch McConnell who's just saying, we're not going to pay any attention to this bill in the Senate. So we'll see what happens.
Great. So folks can either raise their hands to ask a question or type in a question. And we're going to open it up now for questions. So is there questions on the line?
Hey there, that's Brian Beal from Open Democracy. One question that I asked Chris Christie 4 years ago was, we've got to get big money out of politics, and he responded by saying that it's like whack-a-mole, that if we shut off these huge amounts of money going in to fund elections from private sources, it's just going to spout up somewhere else. So what assurances do we have, if any, that if we implement public financing systems, that this money isn't going to come, that the influence isn't going to come back a different way? And I'll use a New Hampshire example where our gubernatorial inauguration celebrations are used as a gigantic slush fund for groups trying to influence the governor. So and this has gone on for both parties, both Democrat and Republican, over the years. Just one example of how money can creep back in and that influence can creep back in. What is the experience in places that have had public funding for a while? Do we see that kind of thing continue, or does that diminish?
Well, let me give two answers to that. You can't just eliminate the big money from politics. In fact, the Supreme Court has said, let's give a big green light to even bigger money in politics. So the question is this question of accountability. And in Connecticut, when asked what is the difference, a veteran lawmaker after a few cycles of public financing there said, on the night before the session closes, that's usually when the lobbyists are all in line at the Speaker of the House's office or outside the Senate President's office, getting their last minute deals in for their clients. And he said this year, because part of that law was lobbyists were, made unimportant in the campaign money process, there were no lines. And so he said, you just watched it get reeled back. That doesn't mean there aren't other ways that the money can come back in the system, but it does make a huge difference. And then people also cite the independent expenditures. And I think we saw a very hopeful sign in Seattle when a huge amount of money poured in, and in the end, it didn't make a difference. They spent unprecedented amounts of money, and more money wouldn't have helped because there was nothing left to buy, and they lost 5 out of 6 races. Now, a key thing there was that money was disclosed, so everybody knew that those big interests, the Chamber and Amazon, were trying to buy the election, and there was a backlash against it. So having the disclosure also helps.
And I'll just quickly add to what Nick said, just very, very quickly, which is that what public financing does is or rather what it does not do, is it does not necessarily match big money, right? Like public financing in Seattle does not match what Amazon was spending. But the key thing is that it provided enough funding so that candidates could be viable and run a vigorous campaign, and a campaign that they had every shot of winning. Kind of the assumption is big money at a certain point, the rate of return kind of levels off. There's a certain level of, you just can't, as Nick said with Amazon, they just couldn't spend any more money. There was no more ads to buy. But what the candidates had is they had grassroots funding that allowed them to vigorously campaign and to run their races as they would want to run them. And that gave them the best chance of winning. So the Supreme Court jurisprudence is very clear, after starting with Buckley v. Vallejo and then into Citizens United, that it's very easy for independent expenditures. So as Nick said, money that's spent not in coordination with a campaign to just flood the market. But our goal is to provide a way for candidates to be viable without acquiescing to that money. And it's complicated and it's not simple. And it's just like our democracy as a whole, it is an ever improving process. That public financing is not the end, but we continue to make it better and continue to close loopholes and continue to make it easier for anybody to run for office.
Right, and Brian, the point about the gubernatorial slush funds and inaugural funds, fighting for tougher disclosure in those funds, but also, right now we have to close the limited liability loophole, which allows companies to just continue to finance elections. So this system provides an alternative, but we still have other work to do to fix lobbying reform and other campaign finance reform. And so, like Nick said, we have to be ambitious and bold in those solutions that we are advocating for. Maybe one bill can't fix all of our problems that we're facing in democracy reform, but that's why we need to fight for a comprehensive democracy agenda, so that more people are participating and more voices are heard. Right now, we have less than 1% of New Hampshire voters who are actually making a political contribution, and we see that 25% of the money is coming from lobbyists. Maybe we don't eliminate all of that, but we create an alternative so that there is a path for citizens' voices. And once these systems have been put in place, other reforms are possible. And some say, well, it's just a voluntary system. Why does it work? But once those voluntary systems have gone into place, you have seen very high participation rates in these systems. And so we need to really continue to fix these problems and do it together. Together we can fix our democracy.
Olivia, I can't seem to find a mechanical way of raising my hand, so I'm doing it this way.
Great, thanks, Liz.
And you said, and Nick also said, that voter participation when this system is in place increases. Nick, can you give us any specifics on that in either the States or in Seattle where this has happened?
I may have meant that candidate participation in the system is big, but I will give an example. That's what I was thinking of, but I will give an example in Seattle this last time. And it's hard to pick it all apart because when you have these big independent expenditures and well-funded candidates, because the voucher system gives them enough money to get the word out, everybody knows there's an election going on. In Seattle, if you opened up your computer, you saw ads all across your screen for the various candidates. And participation for a city council race in an off year, an odd-numbered year, was, I think, 10 points higher than it had been in the comparable race for those seats 4 years earlier. So it boosted participation. And you can say, well, it was all the spending. You might also say, well, yeah, but going door to door, friends asking friends to give vouchers to candidates, raised the profile of the race much more than anything else. So we'll let the academics pull that one apart, but it certainly had incredibly high turnout for a city council race.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, and Liz, I think we really want to get to a point where more people are participating as donors in our democracy. Right now, I think a lot of people have really poor faith. They don't trust the system. And by installing trust that candidates are running as clean candidates or not taking all this corporate money, voters can then begin to trust in this political the system in a much different way. And I think the restoring trust and the fundamental value that the politician is working for the citizen and not for the big corporate special interests, that's what is sort of begins to change the discourse and drive not just people who are making a $5 contribution as a donor, but also people who are starting to pay attention and participate differently in our society.
Yeah.
And there's
I see a question here from Bob,
Mm-hmm.
And I can take a shot at answering it. He's asking about the Government by the People Act, which was the House matching fund system, and also the Fair Elections Now Act in the Senate, which was a combination of grants and matching funds. They've been folded into H.R. 1. I don't think there's a sunset provision, but that change has been added, since over the past year. I might not know about it, but I think they're both in there without an automatic sunset. And so H.R. 1 from the House has been sent to the Senate, has passed the Senate. There is a Senate equivalent there, which has Democratic co-sponsors in full. All the Democratic caucuses supporting it, and at this point, no Republicans. I will say that there's always been some polarization, but 10 or 15 years ago, you could find Republican lawmakers ready to co-sponsor and often vote for these. We had Republican co-sponsors up till very recently on the Government by the People Act. I think what's changed is the price you pay, given some of the big powers within the Republican Party. The cost of endorsing something like this, or co-sponsoring or speaking out on it, is extraordinarily high. And you stick your head up on this, it may get cut off. The most stalwart Republican co-sponsor in the House was primary 3 times in a row because he was enough of a maverick that he supports something like this. Walter Jones was his name. So I think that's a problem. I think on the other hand, if something approaches passing, people will see a reason. If I really believe in this, I'm willing to take flack, but only if my vote's going to put it over the transom, only if something can really pass. So I think the Republican votes will come, but they'll come late. And I know from people who have focused on the bipartisan aspect of this, that they think eventually we can get Republicans, but my guess is it's going to be in some kind of horse trade. There'll be particular provisions they want added in or taken out, but just to get to this point, that point, it'll be relatively late in the game. So I think it's something we won't see right now, but may see when a real bill does come up and has the possibility of passing.
So one very quick thing. Colin, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. One very quick thing is that actually there is one Republican who supported H.R. 1, Nick, and it was the Democrat who, or I guess, was a Democrat and flipped to be a Republican.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, I forgot.
So technically, it's a bipartisan bill, just de facto.
Good pick. Yeah.
I will just say that, about the polarization around this. This is a big problem, and I share Nick's optimism, but right now, Mitch McConnell is a main reason why this isn't passing. There was a big effort in this recent stimulus package that it seems like we have an outline of it, that the Democrats put in about $2 billion to ensure that people could vote during a pandemic, which should be pretty, not very contentious, and the Republicans tried to get rid of it all, and they compromised on a very weak $400 million. So this is a real problem on the federal level, but again, on the state level, you see more Republican lawmakers, not everywhere, but you do see some on the state level. You have more likelihood of getting them to endorse these reforms, as Olivia and everyone have shown in New Hampshire.
And the really thing, which Adam pointed out earlier, is that the grassroots level, rank and file Republicans support these. And you can talk to them using the very same words to get Democrats wanting to vote for this and independents wanting to see this supported. You can get Republicans excited about this and wanting to see it supported. And that's so it's very bipartisan at the grassroots level. At the elected official level, where power politics comes into play, we're running up against some formidable obstacles at this point.
And I think one thing to mention too is that HR 1 does provide 3 states to pilot the Seattle model of voter dollars in their states too. So it's not just one system of public financing. It's a hybrid of multiple systems of public financing. And we got to continue to advocate at the state level, but also at the local level. And Bob Perry, who asked this question, was a member of the New Hampshire Election Law Committee and served on a task force to study public financing. And so I think, as Nick said, persistence matters, and Bob, your persistence matters too. Great. I'm not seeing other questions, but why don't we just open it up for another minute to see if anybody wants to add a question or comment?
Olivia, there's a question it says Olivia Zink, but it's a gentleman. I'm not sure who. Raising his hand.
Jim Howard. Oh, hi, Jim.
I think he's muted.
We're going to unmute him. Okay, Jim, are you on?
There
you go. We can hear you, Jim.
I would just wanted to have you make the point of the bill number and where it is in the legislature at this point in time.
Sure. It's in New Hampshire. The bill we're advocating for is Senate Bill 304, and it has passed the Senate and is headed to the House. It was originally scheduled for a House hearing on March 17th. That House hearing was canceled due to the closure of the legislature. But we will, I'm sure as soon as the legislature goes back into session, that hearing will probably be the first thing up. And so we'll want to be ready for citizens to testify and join in the discourse around this piece of legislation.
Thanks.
Other questions?
I have another question, Olivia. This is Brian again. I have to do, there were probably 3 or 4 different bills that were vetoed last term on free speech grounds. And this certainly is a candidate for that in New Hampshire, in that some would argue that, we're suppressing the right of private money, but that is not the case, correct? That this is an optional system for candidates to either partake in or not.
Correct. This is a voluntary system that's completely constitutional. It does not, as Nick said earlier in the presentation, these have been, there has been lawsuits that have tested these systems, and they hold. Nick, do you want to add more to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court has upheld, and the courts below it at the federal level have upheld public financing for years and years and years. You always, there is a case beginning to sneak its way up that may come before the courts soon that it may take up, which is a direct attack on public financing, but it would be a 180-degree switch for this court to do that. Now, the Roberts Court has been known to do 180-degree switches from past policy. But it has held up and it's been popular. You know, it's voluntary. Some people say, oh, well, what good is that if it's voluntary? But most candidates will say, if I can talk to people, you know, constituents and ask them for $10 or ask everyday people for vouchers, and I don't have to go ask lobbyists for money, that's a no-brainer for me. And so most candidates say that. In Connecticut, they've had their highest level of participation ever, or just about 90%, a little over for one chamber, a little under for the other. Among winners. So not just also running candidates, but the winners are participating at that level. And I actually took a look at the people who didn't take up public financing. And it was mostly people who were in, you know, very urban single party districts who said, I don't really need any money to run, right? Or people without opponents or people within party dominant districts where they weren't going to really need money to win, to run. And in almost every other district, including really competitive ones, people use the system. So if you design it right, people will use it.
You just made an argument for fixing gerrymandering too.
Yes. Well, it's also an argument for making sure that money is available in the primary, right? And some people say, well, let's just try this for the general election. But that means there are a whole bunch of districts where you just, you know, it's not going to work.
Well, thank you all so much for joining today's educational forum via Zoom. We would always love to see your faces in person, but we appreciate you joining via remotely today. And, as we continue our advocacy, please reach out to us with questions or concerns. This is recorded and available for you to share with your friends and family members.
Thanks, Olivia, for organizing this, and open democracy, the way to go.